Corrupt sheriff slaps Navy admiral during airport emergency. He had no idea who he touched. The storm rolled in without warning. Flight 782 had already begun its descent into Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport when the turbulence hit. What started as light shaking quickly turned violent. Overhead bins rattled. Oxygen masks trembled in their compartments. A flight attendant stumbled into a seat as lightning split the sky outside the window. Passengers gripped armrests. Some prayed. Others stared blankly at the wing as it dipped sharply to the left. In seat 2A, a tall, silver-haired man remained completely still. Rear Admiral Thomas Caldwell had spent 35 years in the United States Navy. He had stood on carrier decks during typhoons. He had commanded fleets through contested waters. Turbulence didn't frighten him, but this felt different. The aircraft dropped suddenly, not a few feet, but what felt like an elevator cable snapping. Gasps filled the cabin. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, strained but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing severe crosswinds. Please remain seated." The landing gear deployed with a heavy mechanical thud. Rain lashed the windows. The runway lights shimmered through sheets of water. The plane hit the ground hard. Not a smooth touchdown, not routine, a violent slam. The right side bounced. A tire burst with a sharp explosion. The aircraft lurched sideways, skidding across wet asphalt before grinding to a halt in a spray of sparks and smoke. Screams erupted. Overhead bins burst open. Luggage spilled into the aisle. The scent of burnt rubber filled the cabin. "Evacuate! Evacuate!" a flight attendant shouted. Emergency slides deployed. Rain poured in as doors opened. Passengers scrambled out into chaos, flashing airport vehicles, shouting ground crews, the deafening howl of wind. Caldwell moved calmly, helping an elderly woman steady herself before stepping onto the rain-soaked tarmac. Sirens wailed in the distance. Within minutes, airport security vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Among them was a black and white SUV marked with the insignia of the county sheriff's department. Sheriff Daniel Brody stepped out. He was a large man with a square jaw and a reputation that traveled faster than his patrol lights. Known for aggressive enforcement and questionable conduct, Brody had built his image on dominance. People didn't argue with him, they complied. The emergency landing had drawn media attention already. Cameras were setting up near the perimeter fence. Brody surveyed the scene and barked orders to deputies. "Lock down the area. Nobody leaves until we know what happened." Passengers huddled under emergency blankets near the terminal entrance. Rain soaked their clothes. Some were crying, others were angry. Admiral Caldwell stood near the aircraft, speaking quietly with a shaken flight attendant. Brody noticed him immediately. The Admiral's posture stood out, straight-backed, composed, authoritative even in silence. Brody approached. "You, step away from the aircraft." Caldwell turned calmly. "I'm assisting." "Didn't ask. Step away." Caldwell obliged without argument. But then he saw something else. A young mechanic was being shoved aggressively by one of Brody's deputies. The mechanic, no older than 23, was trying to explain something about the tire failure. "He's lying," the deputy barked. Caldwell stepped forward instinctively. "That young man is trying to give you information," Caldwell said firmly. "You might want to listen." Brody's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly are you?" "Thomas Caldwell." "Occupation?" Caldwell paused only a second. "United States Navy." Brody scoffed. "Everyone's something." He stepped closer, invading Caldwell's personal space. "This is my scene, my jurisdiction. You don't tell my deputies what to do." Caldwell's voice remained level. "I'm suggesting professionalism." The word hung in the rain-filled air. Professionalism. For Brody, it felt like a challenge. "What I see," Brody growled, is a civilian interfering with an active investigation. I'm not interfering. You just did. A crowd had begun to watch. Smartphones were recording. Brody's temper flared, not because of what was said, but because he sensed control slipping. The media vans were arriving. He needed authority. He needed dominance. "You think that Navy talk scares me?" Brody muttered. Caldwell didn't respond. That silence ignited something. And then it happened. A sharp crack echoed through the rain. Brody's hand struck Caldwell across the face. The slap was loud, violent, unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the gathered passengers. Phones lifted higher. Caldwell didn't stumble. He didn't retaliate. He simply turned his head back slowly, rain dripping from his jawline, eyes steady. In 3 decades of command, he had faced hostile admirals, foreign ministers, and combat threats. But this was different. Brody realized, too late, that the cameras were rolling. "What are you gonna do about it?" Brody taunted quietly. Caldwell reached into his soaked jacket pocket. Slowly, carefully, he pulled out a leather credential case. He opened it. The badge inside gleamed under flashing emergency lights. Rear Admiral Thomas Caldwell, United States Navy, Fleet Operations Command. Brody blinked. "You assaulted a flag officer," Caldwell said evenly. The air seemed to freeze despite the storm. Within minutes, black SUVs began arriving. Not local police, federal. Agents stepped out, suits drenched instantly by rain. Their movements were efficient, coordinated. One approached Caldwell immediately. "Admiral, are you injured?" "I'm fine," Caldwell replied. The agent's gaze shifted to Brody. "Sheriff Daniel Brody?" Brody's confidence cracked slightly. "This is my jurisdiction." The agent didn't flinch. "You were being detained pending federal investigation." "What?" Brody barked. Another agent stepped forward, already reading from a device. "Preliminary charges include assault on a federal officer, obstruction, and misconduct during an aviation emergency." The deputies looked at each other, uncertain. Cameras captured everything. Passengers whispered. Brody tried to regain footing. "This is ridiculous! He provoked!" Caldwell interrupted calmly. "I suggested professionalism." The words hit harder than the slap. Brody was escorted toward the SUV. Rain washed across the runway as flashing lights reflected in puddles. But the story didn't end there. Within hours, footage of the incident spread across social media. Headlines exploded. The phrase, "Sheriff slaps Navy Admiral," trended nationwide. News outlets began digging. It wasn't long before older complaints against Brody resurfaced. Excessive force allegations, intimidation claims, misconduct reports buried quietly in internal files. Federal investigators expanded their scope. The emergency landing itself was later ruled a mechanical failure due to severe weather. No criminal negligence, no sabotage. The mechanic Caldwell defended had been correct about the tire rupture. But Brody's actions had nothing to do with aviation safety. They had everything to do with ego. 3 days later, Brody stood in front of a courthouse, not as a commanding sheriff, but as a defendant. Caldwell did not attend. He had returned to Washington, D.C., resuming briefings and command duties without public comment. When asked for a statement, he gave only one sentence: "Authority without discipline is dangerous." The county appointed an interim sheriff. Internal investigations uncovered evidence of intimidation and abuse spanning years. The slap that echoed across a rain-soaked runway had triggered something larger than one arrest. It exposed a pattern. Months later, when Caldwell addressed a graduating class of naval officers, he never mentioned the airport. Instead, he spoke about restraint. He said, "Power is measured not by how loudly you assert it, but by how calmly you control it." Back in Texas, the runway at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport returned to normal operations. Planes landed smoothly, travelers moved on. But for those who had stood in that storm, one memory remained clear: the sound of a slap, and the moment a corrupt sheriff realized he had no idea who he touched.